The first time I realized somebody thought money could erase 40 years of history was the day I found a steel gate where my family road used to be. I just sat there with my truck idling, staring through the bars at the driveway that led to my own property, wondering how in the world someone could lock a man out of land he'd legally owned for years and still sleep at night. The funny thing is, that gate ended up costing them a whole lot more than it ever cost me. My name's Ethan Calloway, and if you'd met me before all this happened, you probably would have described me as the kind of guy who keeps to himself. I live outside a little town most people drive through without ever noticing, on 26 acres of hardwood timber, pasture, and a weathered farmhouse my parents bought back in the late 70s when land around here wasn't worth much more than the taxes on it. Back then there weren't fancy subdivisions or luxury resorts. There were cattle, old pickup trucks, neighbors who waved whether they liked you or not, and one gravel road that crossed another man's farm before reaching our place. My dad used to joke that the road belonged to everybody and nobody at the same time. It physically crossed our neighbor Walter Green's property, but before my parents signed the paperwork, Walter insisted on doing things the right way. He drove into town with my father, walked into the county recorder's office, and signed a permanent easement that guaranteed our family legal access forever. Dad framed a copy of that paperwork in his workshop, not because he loved legal documents, but because he'd grown up poor enough to understand that a promise written down lasts longer than a handshake. I didn't appreciate that lesson until years later. Life stayed simple for decades. Walter raised cattle. My parents raised me. We borrowed equipment from each other, fixed fences together after storms, argued about football every fall, and nobody ever questioned who could drive down that gravel road. After my parents passed away within 3 years of each other, I inherited everything. I wasn't trying to become some wealthy landowner. I just wanted to keep the place alive. I fixed up the old farmhouse and rented it out to a retired schoolteacher named Martha, who loved gardening more than television. I'd spend weekends maintaining trails through the woods, checking fences, cutting fallen trees after storms, and sitting on Dad's old porch with a cup of coffee thinking about how quiet life could be when nobody was trying to impress anybody else. Then Walter died, and that's when everything changed. His children weren't interested in ranching, so they sold almost 200 acres to a development company called Blue Summit Hospitality. Within months, bulldozers rolled in. Trees disappeared. Survey flags popped up everywhere. Concrete trucks became part of the morning soundtrack. Before long, a massive luxury RV resort started taking shape just beyond my property line. I'm talking about million-dollar motor coaches, outdoor fireplaces bigger than my first apartment, fountains, golf cart paths, and enough decorative stone to build a castle. At first I figured it wasn't my business. People are allowed to build what they want on land they own, and I honestly hoped the project would bring more business into town. Then one Tuesday afternoon, a black luxury SUV rolled into my driveway. Out stepped a man named Preston Hale. Perfect haircut, pressed shirt without a wrinkle, expensive watch that probably cost more than my truck, and the kind of smile that always looked rehearsed. He introduced himself as the resort's operations director and complimented my property before getting straight to the point. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "our investors are concerned about maintaining an exclusive experience for future guests. We'd like to discuss purchasing your access easement." I laughed because I honestly thought he was kidding. "Purchasing the road?" I asked. "Not exactly," he replied. "We'd compensate you generously, $75,000, and we'll help construct a new access route around the eastern side of the development." I almost admired how confidently he said it. Almost. "Have you actually walked that eastern side?" I asked. He admitted he hadn't. So I explained it to him. Dense woods, a steep creek bed, solid rock in 2 places. Nearly 2 miles before reaching the county road. Building there wouldn't just be inconvenient, it'd cost a small fortune. "That road already exists," I told him, pointing toward the gravel lane. "My parents paid for improvements. The easement is permanent. I'm not interested." His smile faded just enough for me to notice. "Sometimes cooperation benefits everyone," he said. "Sometimes buying land comes with responsibilities," I answered. "One of yours happens to be respecting recorded property rights." We stood there for another minute in uncomfortable silence before he climbed back into his SUV. As he rolled his window down one last time, he looked at me with a calm expression that somehow felt more threatening than yelling ever could. "I hope you'll reconsider," he said. "Things change. I watched him disappear down the gravel road, and remember thinking he sounded less like a businessman making an offer and more like someone quietly promising a problem. I had no idea that within a few months, I'd discover exactly what he meant, and by then, the fight wouldn't just be about a road anymore. It would become a battle over arrogance, greed, and one forgotten clause buried inside a decades-old easement that nobody on their side had bothered to read. A few months slipped by, and for a while I convinced myself maybe I'd misread Preston. Construction crews kept coming and going. The resort slowly transformed from a noisy work site into something you'd expect to see in a glossy travel magazine. And aside from a little extra traffic, my routine stayed about the same. Martha was still renting the farmhouse. The deer still wandered through the back pasture every evening. And every Saturday, I'd drive down that gravel road, wave at whoever happened to be working near the entrance, and head home without giving the resort much thought. Looking back, I think that was exactly what they wanted. They waited until nearly every cabin was finished, every luxury RV pad was rented months in advance, and every investor had already celebrated what they believed would be their biggest success. Then one Friday morning, everything changed. I had promised Martha I'd bring over a replacement water heater because hers had finally given up after nearly 20 years. I loaded it into my truck, grabbed my toolbox, and headed down the familiar road. About half a mile before reaching my property, I hit the brakes so hard the water heater nearly came through the cab. Standing across the road was a brand new black steel security gate nearly 10 feet wide. Decorative stone columns had been built on both sides. Cameras pointed directly at approaching vehicles, and a keypad blocked the entrance. Hanging in the center was a polished metal sign that read Private Resort Property. Authorized guests only. For a second I honestly wondered if I had somehow taken the wrong road. Then I saw the mailbox with my family's name sitting on the other side of the gate exactly where it had always been. My mailbox, behind someone else's lock. I climbed out, walked up to the keypad, and pressed the call button. A young security guard answered through the speaker. "Can I help you?" "Yeah," I said, trying to stay calm. "I live back there." He looked at a clipboard before shaking his head. "Sir, residents of the resort only." "I'm not a resort resident. My property is beyond the resort." He looked confused, disappeared for a minute, then came back with another man wearing a management badge. The manager glanced at me like he'd already been briefed. "I'm sorry, sir. We've been instructed not to allow outside traffic through the property." I actually laughed because it sounded so ridiculous. Outside traffic? My family's been using this road since Jimmy Carter was president. He shrugged. "Those are my instructions. Then call Preston Hale." He disappeared again. A few minutes later, he returned holding a cordless phone. Preston's voice came through before I even spoke. "Good morning, Ethan." He sounded almost cheerful. "Open the gate." Silence. Then he sighed dramatically. "We've decided to prioritize the safety and privacy of our guests. You still have the option of developing alternate access." "There is no alternate access." "That's unfortunate. You're blocking a recorded easement. Our attorneys believe the language is open to interpretation." I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. "You're making a huge mistake." His answer still sticks with me. Sometimes progress requires difficult decisions. Then he hung up. I stood there staring at the phone like I'd just heard someone confess to robbing a bank in broad daylight. The security guard wouldn't even look me in the eye. He knew it was wrong. We both did. But he was following orders. I drove back into town and called the only attorney I'd ever trusted, Rebecca Lawson. She specialized in property law and had handled boundary disputes for farmers across 3 counties. When I walked into her office carrying the easement paperwork my father had preserved all those years, she spread every document across her conference table, adjusted her glasses, and spent nearly an hour reading without saying much. Finally, she leaned back, folded her arms, and smiled. "Well," she said, "they've managed to turn a simple property dispute into something much more expensive." Meaning they're dead wrong. She pointed at the recorded easement. "Permanent. Transferable. Clearly described. It doesn't disappear because somebody builds a luxury resort over it." We immediately sent a formal demand letter requiring Blue Summit Hospitality to remove the gate within 48 hours. Their response arrived the next afternoon from one of the largest law firms in the state. 8 pages of polished legal language claiming the easement description had become outdated due to modern development. arguing that the original farm road no longer existed in its historic form, and suggesting I should cooperate in creating a new route for the mutual benefit of all involved parties. Rebecca read it once, smiled again, and tossed it onto her desk. Translation? I asked. They're hoping you can't afford to fight. We filed for an emergency injunction the same day. Court dates, unfortunately, don't happen overnight. Until the hearing, the gate stayed locked. That meant every single visit to my property turned into a 2-mile hike through rough woods carrying whatever supplies I needed on my back. The first weekend, I hauled chainsaw fuel, groceries, and plumbing tools through knee-high brush. By the time I reached the farmhouse, I was soaked with sweat. Martha met me on the porch looking worried. "This can't keep happening," she said quietly. "I'm not leaving," I told her. She smiled sadly. "I'm not worried about me. I'm worried about you." A week later, one of the delivery companies refused to bring heating oil because they couldn't legally reach the property. Then Martha's daughter called asking if she should start looking for another rental in case access never returned. That phone call hit harder than the gate itself. It wasn't just about me anymore. Someone else's home had become collateral damage because a corporation decided exclusivity mattered more than the law. Every evening I'd sit in Dad's old workshop flipping through boxes of documents, partly searching for anything useful and partly because being surrounded by his handwriting somehow helped me think. One night, I found an old rolled-up survey map secured with brittle masking tape. Across the bottom, in my father's neat block letters, he'd written, "Never lose this. Utility corridor follows easement." I stared at those 5 words longer than I'd like to admit. Utility corridor. I'd completely forgotten. Back in the early 80s, when electricity finally reached our property, the power company buried electrical lines alongside the easement. Years later came water service, telephone cables, then fiber internet. Every utility followed the exact same recorded corridor because that was the legal access route. I spread more maps across the workbench. The corridor wasn't just for driving. It protected underground infrastructure too. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. The resort had spent tens of millions building luxury accommodations. They certainly hadn't installed an entirely separate utility network through solid rock when perfectly good lines already existed. The next morning, Rebecca and I drove the length of the resort as far as we legally could. Every electrical pedestal feeding those expensive RV sites lined up almost perfectly with the original easement corridor. Water valves appeared at regular intervals exactly where the county utility maps suggested they would. Even the communication boxes followed the same path. Rebecca looked at me, then looked back toward the resort clubhouse where fountains sprayed into the air and decorative lights glowed despite the afternoon sun. Slowly, a grin spread across her face. "Ethan," she said, almost laughing, "please tell me these people didn't actually do what I think they did." "What?" "I think they're using the easement they blocked to power their entire business." Neither of us said another word for several seconds. Then she pulled out her phone and started making calls. First the electric cooperative, then the county water authority, then the telecommunications provider. Engineers agreed to inspect everything within days. As we drove away, I looked back at the perfectly landscaped entrance with its stone walls, luxury signage, and polished steel gate. Just a week earlier I'd felt trapped, angry, and exhausted. For the first time since all this started, those feelings gave way to something else entirely. Hope. Because if our suspicion turned out to be true, Preston Hale hadn't simply violated my access rights. He had built the beating heart of his multi-million-dollar resort directly on top of the very easement he claimed no longer mattered. And if that was true, the fight was about to become much bigger than either side had expected. The inspections moved faster than I expected. Within 3 days, engineers from the electric cooperative, the county water authority, and the communications provider were walking the easement with stacks of maps that hadn't seen daylight in decades. I tagged along behind them, trying not to get my hopes up too high, while Rebecca quietly took notes and snapped photographs every few minutes. The lead electrical engineer finally stopped beside one of the resort's distribution boxes, compared a set of coordinates, and shook his head with a little grin. "Well, this explains everything." He pointed toward a row of luxury RV sites stretching into the distance. "Every one of those hookups is being fed through infrastructure located inside this recorded easement corridor." The water authority reached the same conclusion an hour later. Their main service valves, pressure controls, and maintenance access all followed the identical route. Even the fiber optic technician confirmed that the communications lines serving the resort had been installed within the same protected corridor. Rebecca slowly closed her notebook and looked at me. "Congratulations," she said with a smile. "They just turned your lawsuit into their worst investment decision." She immediately amended our filing, adding claims for interference with easement rights, financial damages, lost rental income, attorney fees, and requesting permanent injunctive relief. More importantly, she attached every engineer's report, every survey, every utility map, and every photograph. Suddenly, this wasn't just my word against theirs. We had independent professionals confirming exactly what my father had protected all those years ago. Court day arrived 2 weeks later. I won't pretend I wasn't nervous. I'd never been involved in anything this big before. Blue Summit Hospitality showed up looking like they were preparing for a corporate merger instead of a property dispute. Preston walked in wearing another expensive suit, flanked by 2 attorneys carrying matching leather briefcases. He nodded at me with the same polished smile he'd worn the first day he visited my property, but this time it looked forced. Rebecca leaned over and whispered, "Confidence is usually loud until evidence starts talking." When the hearing began, their lead attorney argued that modern development had fundamentally changed the character of the original roadway, that resort security justified restricting outside traffic, and that alternative access could eventually be constructed if necessary. It sounded impressive, right up until Rebecca stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't try to perform for the courtroom. She simply handed the judge the original easement deed, the recorded survey, utility maps, photographs of the locked gate, copies of the engineer reports, and one aerial image showing the resort's entire infrastructure running directly through my easement. The judge spent several quiet minutes reading. Nobody spoke. Nobody shuffled papers. Then he looked over the top of his glasses toward Preston. "Let me be certain I understand this correctly," he said calmly. "Your company blocked the plaintiff from using a legally recorded easement while simultaneously relying upon that same easement to provide electrical service, water distribution, and communications infrastructure for your commercial development." Neither attorney answered immediately. One finally attempted to explain that utility placement was handled by contractors during construction. The judge interrupted him. "Contractors do not erase recorded property rights." Another uncomfortable silence filled the courtroom. Then came the sentence I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. "This court finds the plaintiff has demonstrated a clear likelihood of success on the merits. The defendant will remove all barriers obstructing lawful access within 24 hours. Failure to comply will result in sanctions of $10,000 per day until compliance is achieved." Preston's shoulders dropped. One of his attorneys quietly closed his notebook. The hearing wasn't dramatic in the Hollywood sense. Nobody yelled. Nobody slammed a fist on the table. But you could actually feel the momentum disappear from their side of the room. By that afternoon, workers were already dismantling the steel gate. I drove down that gravel road before sunset, partly because I needed to check on Martha, and partly because I wanted to see that empty entrance with my own eyes. She met me outside the farmhouse holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Looks like your road came back," she said. I smiled. Turns out it never left. We both laughed harder than the joke probably deserved. Most people think that's where the story ends, but it wasn't. The injunction reopened my access. Yet Rebecca reminded me that reopening the road didn't erase the financial harm they'd already caused. Martha had nearly moved away. Rental income had been interrupted. I had spent weeks hauling supplies through the woods, missed work, and paid legal expenses to stop something that never should have happened. The civil case moved forward over the following months, and the evidence only became stronger during discovery. Internal emails revealed executives had discussed the easement before construction even began. One message suggested they could deal with the owner later because they believed he wouldn't have the resources to challenge a large corporation. Reading that line made me angrier than the gate ever had. It wasn't arrogance born from ignorance. It was calculated. They knew the risk. They simply assumed money would outlast patience. The final judgment awarded compensation for my losses, required the company to pay my attorney fees, and entered a permanent injunction prohibiting any future interference with my access rights. More importantly, the easement remained exactly where it had always been, protecting not only my driveway, but every utility serving my land. A few months after everything was over, Preston asked to meet one last time. We stood beside the same gravel road where he'd first offered to buy my easement. This time his tone was completely different. "Our investors would like to purchase your property," he said. The number he offered was far higher than before, enough that most people probably would have accepted without thinking twice. I looked past him toward the road my parents had fought to protect all those years ago. I could almost hear my father's voice reminding me that some things are worth more than the biggest check someone can write. I smiled politely and shook my head. "You know," I said, "if you'd simply respected the agreement that was already there, we probably would have been good neighbors." He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He just nodded once, got back into his SUV, and drove away. I never saw him again. Every time I drive down that gravel road now, I think less about winning a lawsuit and more about what nearly got lost. Property rights aren't just lines on paper. Sometimes they're family history. Sometimes they're promises between neighbors made decades before any corporation ever arrived. And sometimes the smallest sentence hidden inside an old legal document can outweigh millions of dollars in polished marketing plans. Now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have sold the property after everything that happened, or would you have kept it exactly like I did? Let me know down in the comments because I genuinely want to hear where you stand. If you enjoyed this story and believe standing up for your rights is always worth the fight, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who loves real property disputes where the law, not the loudest voice, gets the final word.